Wichita Liberty TV.
Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Kansas and Wichita government and public affairs. We're broadcast on Great Plains Television. That's channel 26.1. It's Sunday morning at 8:30, then repeated again in the afternoon at 4:30. Of course, there's also my site. That's the Voice for Liberty at wichitaliberty.org. There you'll find all the old episodes of Wichita Liberty TV, show notes for each episode if there's something you need to know about, and then all the other content that I and others produce each and every day. Well, today our guest is David Schneider. He is Regional Director for Citizens for Self-Governance. One of that organization's projects is the Convention of States, and that's the topic of today's show. So, David, welcome to Wichita Liberty TV. Got our co-host Carl Peterjohn here. So, I think I know a little bit about Convention of States, not a whole lot. So for my benefit and the benefit of our viewers, what is the Convention of States?
Sure, thanks, Bob. Convention of States refers to the Constitution itself, specifically Article 5 of the United States Constitution, which refers to the Amendments Clause and how to amend the Constitution. And our organization is centered around or trying to invoke the second clause in Article 5, which is where the states get together in a convention forum and make proposals for new amendments to the United States Constitution. The thought process is we bypass the federal government through this way, and we all know that the federal government is never going to propose amendments to limit their own power, and we've seen it time and time again. And the states, we believe, once they get together, can make those type of proposals.
So the traditional way that the Constitution's been amended is that Congress passes the amendment and then states have to vote to approve it. Is that right?
That's correct. So the first clause in Article 5 states that Congress can make proposals. 2/3 of Congress actually can make a proposal. And then again, the states would have the final say as far as the ratification. And the second part, the ratification parts, none changed, either if, in fact, the Congress makes those proposals just like we've always done, or if the states make the proposals through a convention like Convention of States is trying to get done.
So the states would get together. Well, the governor of the state, who from each state would get together at this convention?
Well, it's up to each state to decide who gets to go to this particular convention. Now, keep in mind, we've never had an Article 5 convention in the past, and there's some people scared about that fact, but we've had 30 other interstate conventions thus far in our history, even before we were a founded country.
So all the amendments to the Constitution have been passed in the regular way. Congress passes and then states ratify. I guess maybe the first 10 were the Bill of Rights, but after that.
Yeah, all of the amendments were proposed by the Congress.
And how many states have to ratify?
It's 38 states have to ratify any proposed amendment, whether it comes from Congress or from a convention of states.
All right.
So it's 34 states that actually have to get together and call for the convention, and that's what we're working on now. Currently, we have 12 states that have passed the resolution calling for this particular convention, and our application, our actual call for the convention is a little bit specific to 3 areas, and it's proposed amendments to limit the size, scope, and jurisdiction of the federal government, term limits on federal officials, and fiscal restraints on the federal government. So anything being proposed or thought about outside of those 3 subject matters would be ingermane to the convention.
Carl?
Well, the question I was going to throw out, we could have 34 states, it'd be 2/3, to call for the convention. But the question might be, is there any sort of a weighting like we have in the House of Representatives, or is it just, you could have all the smaller states say, yes, we want in, and all the relatively larger states say, yes, no, we don't, and it's just 34 states.
Sure, 34 states is what is required. It doesn't matter if they're small or if they're large. The Constitution is very specific on this, and it gives direction to Congress to act. So once the 34 threshold is met, Congress shall call the convention, is what the actual Constitution reads.
Well, some have said, why bother? We already have a continuing constitutional convention. It's called the United States Supreme Court. How would you answer that?
Well, that is true, to your point. We do have an ongoing constitutional convention in the Supreme Court. They've made some egregious rulings what we find is we've lacked the oversight or the check and balances that were set in place in the Constitution. You know, we all learned growing up in the three different branches of government, we're supposed to check and balance each other out. But what we found is now that the Supreme Court really doesn't have a check, or is one's not being used. And this is the other check that was put into the Constitution by the Founding Fathers, is for the states to be a check on the judiciary, as well as the federal government overall through this convention process. There's been a history of rulings by the Supreme Court where we've had amendments to the Constitution to fix. And what we're looking for is some of those type of amendments to come through this process.
Okay, hang on to that idea for just a moment. We're going to take our first commercial break. Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks with co-host Carl Peter John, our guest David Schneider, talking about convention of states. So we were talking about the ongoing constitutional convention, and of course by that we mean that the Constitution has words in it, but what those words mean is really what the Supreme Court says it means. And it seems like they have gone out of their way sometimes, where some years ago a farmer raising corn to feed to his own hogs was somehow considered to be interstate commerce. Is that the type of maybe overreach that we're talking about?
That's exactly right. The Commerce Clause is one of the most abused clauses in the Constitution. It's something that needs to be probably spelled out a little differently and fixed, as far as spelled specific language as far as what is commerce and what isn't commerce. We all know that shouldn't be interstate commerce, but yet the Supreme Court has allowed it to happen. It's essentially given Congress carte blanche authority, and that's something that needs to be fixed.
So earlier you talked about, I think that there were three things. One was term limits, the other was fiscal responsibility, which I think from my reading talks about a balanced budget amendment. Is that the heart of that? And then what would the third prong be?
Yeah, of course, fiscal restraints is what we're talking about, and balanced budget would be a part of that, but only a part. You know, we could look at tax reform, even a repeal of the income tax itself within that scope, as well as, probably most importantly, a general accounting principles placed onto the federal government. Currently, they operate in their own accounting system. You know, it could be unicorns and rainbows accounting. I'm not sure what kind of accounting it is, but if you and I practice that kind of accounting, we'd probably be in federal prison. So we need to put those same kind of principles on our federal government. Expect real numbers to come out of Washington, D.C. instead of these fake numbers that we see now.
So term limits are something, some states have that on their legislature. A lot of states have it on their executive, like we have the governor, because it's real easy for the legislature to put term limits on others, but not themselves. What would term limits be? Well, a good number of terms for a House member or a senator, do you think?
Sure. You know, we actually held a simulated Article 5 convention last September, and there was people that we had delegates into that convention that did not like term limits at all. We had some that wanted very short term limits, but they discussed term limits in detail. And what they came up with was 12 years in both the House and the Senate.
So 2 terms for senators, 6 terms for...
That's what they came up with, yes. Now, what I would be pushing for myself personally, now this is my own personal opinion, is to allow the states to decide this. If they want to put term limits on their federal officials, let them, because currently the Supreme Court says they can't do that.
Right.
So I'd like to be able to have Missouri, which they did pass a constitutional amendment to their own constitution, to put those term limits on their federal officials, and the Supreme Court overruled them.
You know, just of interest, I think our former Representative Mike Pompeo was involved in that when he was a lawyer, not far out of law school. I think it was in Arkansas, but term limits. Balanced budget, that sounds good, but people point out to me that a budget could be balanced in 2 ways. How did we do it in Kansas? Well, we didn't cut spending, we raised taxes. And of course, we have a balanced budget, at least for a short term, but you know, balanced budgets can be balanced in several ways.
Yeah, that is correct, and that's why we're not promoting a balanced budget just by itself. There's been efforts to have a convention just for a balanced budget for the last 40 years. They haven't gotten to the prerequisite 34 states. We firmly believe because it's not the solution. It's more of a symptom-based. Now, we believe that it needs to be part of the package, but again, it needs to be a package of amendments, much like Mark Levin has promoted in his book, The Liberty Amendments.
I think, Carl,
Which
you have
I
that book
brought
there.
a copy of it here.
So was that kind of the birth of the Convention of States?
Well, it's actually an interesting story, and no, it was not. It was more of a coincidence. Mark Levin was writing his book at the very same time our founders for our organization, Mark Meckler and Michael Ferris, were devising this particular organization. They were not talking, they hadn't talked until about 2 weeks before this book was dropped. And let's just say Mark Levin was surprised that this organization was kicking off, and he thought somebody had stolen his
Independent
idea.
efforts really, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, with the lead time of writing a book, that may not have happened. But
Right.
Well, Dave, let me throw out one of the critical questions I've heard from a lot of folks who I think would generally be on our side of the political fence, but who would say, wait a minute, this convention can run away in a direction of, we will put Obamacare into our Constitution, for instance. We will make, the left says, you have a right to all these things, and I can reach into anyone's pocket, and whether it's housing, health care, food, you name it, free Obama phones. This is the direction it would take us.
Well, definitely, Carl, that's a big question, and we've got to take a break in just for a moment. So we're going to take that break and let us prepare an answer, or let David, I should say, prepare an answer to that, because that is a common objection, that this convention, there are people in California who want other things than maybe what some of us here in Kansas. Heck, we know there are people in Kansas who want other things than what I think we should have. Anyway, so let's take a moment off, and when we come back, we're going to see what is the big objection to some of the ideas of the Convention of States. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks with co-host Carl Peter John, David Schneider from the Convention of the States. So before the break, we were talking about an objection or a criticism that some people have of the Convention of States, and that if you're going to get people together to dream up new constitutional amendments, then that could go anywhere, could it, or could it not?
Well, first of all, no, it can't. First, we have 34 states calling for the very same topic. So we know the topic for the convention. Those 34 states would send delegates with specific instructions to only talk about those particular topics. So right to start the convention, you have a supermajority of states that have all agreed what the topic is going to be for that particular convention.
And what is the mechanism that enforces that those topics are limited?
Well, each of the states would provide their delegates, or their commissioners actually is the technical term, a commission. They would have their commission, which spells out exactly what they can do and what they can't do. And it would be tied to the actual application that state had passed, or that resolution that the legislature had passed.
That the legislature passed.
That's correct. So besides the majority of those states already agreeing to what the topics are before this, we'd have to believe that a majority of those would have to go awry. So we'd have to believe if something crazy came out of that and it would step outside of those bounds, the majority of those states would willfully go against what their legislature had determined be what they're supposed to be there to do. And then if we believe that to be the case, we also have to believe that the state's not watching those particular commissioners and not paying attention. The day of Twitter and social media, they're not really watching what's going on in this big event. Yeah. And then finally, if they did get something like this through the convention, just remember it has to be ratified.
And that's 38 states?
It's 38 states, but more importantly, it's 13 states can block anything. So that's a tall number, 13 states. Now, if you want to dig into that number a little further, it's one chamber or one House or one Senate in 13 states could just not bring it up, and it's dead.
So both chambers in Kansas, it'd be the House and the Senate, would both have to approve.
Yes.
If one of them failed to, then Kansas would not be amongst the 38.
And it's even a higher bar in Kansas. We have to have a 2/3 majority in both the House and both the Senate as well to agree to any change to allow Kansas to join this effort.
But wouldn't these amendments continue? And I think back to the fact that the original Bill of Rights, there were 12 amendments proposed. Only 10 were adopted. But interestingly enough, one of the two that wasn't adopted kind of hung around, and was concerning congressional compensation and
Yes,
pay,
that's
which is
correct.
very sensitive. And interestingly enough, it was ratified within our lifetimes. In fact, I don't remember the exact year.
1992, I believe.
But it's one of maybe even the newest
It is.
amendment to the U.S.
It
Constitution.
is. The 27th Amendment was part of the original Bill of Rights. Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And the person that actually found out that it was still hanging out there is a huge supporter of convention states. He's part of our effort down in Texas. But besides that point, you were talking about a time limit. They can hang out there. Well, all the recent proposals from Congress have all had time limits on them, either a 5-10 year time frame, and we would suspect that the states would probably do the same thing to avoid that type of situation.
And not all amendments passed. The Equal Rights Amendment,
No.
I think, in our lifetime
correct.
was one that was proposed by Congress but failed to get
That's
that.
correct.
I had a question. So 34 states have to get the ball rolling to hold the convention. Would the states who did not approve the convention, would they participate in the convention?
That's up to them, but I would say they wouldn't want to sit at home. They would want to have
sure.
a say or a vote in it. And it's very important for everybody to understand that each state only has one vote, despite whatever their population is. That precedent is very, very clear. In every convention that's ever been held, every state only has one vote. It doesn't matter if you're California or Texas, one of the bigger states as far as population.
And if I remember what you said, states could send, like, let's say, their governor as the sole representative of the state, or they could send their entire legislature. Is that right? Or
Yeah, unless the states agree, those 34 states agree to
Okay.
a certain procedure as far as
Right.
how many delegates. Yeah, there has been a convention in past. It wasn't an Article 5 convention, but it was a convention that was before the Civil War, where Tennessee sent 100 delegates to that particular convention. So there's some precedence for that, but Tennessee only got one vote in that particular convention.
sounds like a junket. And
Yeah.
yeah, and
Sounds like a presidential nominating convention,
yeah.
where
You
you
know-
often have over 100 delegates. So.
Sure.
getting people together, or where each state is only one vote. We're going through that right now in the House of Cards, where the election was deadlocked, and Frank Underwood and Will Conway, they had to battle out in the House of Representatives, one vote per state,
That's
no matter
correct.
how many they are. So
That
that's
is a unique
not going to
thing.
say what happened, because that's just came out. We don't want to be a spoiler here, but there was that problem there. So let's take another moment off for a commercial break, and when we come back, we'll finish up this episode of Wichita Liberty TV. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks with co-host Carl Peterjohn and our guest David Schneider, talking about Convention of the States. So I think recently that Texas got on this bandwagon. If you could explain, what did they have to do to join the movement, and then what's happening in Kansas with regard to this?
Well, actually, Texas and Missouri just jumped on board, and I was a big part of both of those passages as part of my region that I participate in, as well as North Dakota earlier this year as well. What Kansas needs to do is pass a resolution through their House and Senate, and it's just calling for this particular convention to happen and to join the 12 other states that have already passed the same identical languaged resolution.
So this is, you said, a resolution, which is different from a statute. A statute, a law, the governor must sign, but this resolution is just the legislature. Is it a majority or 2/3 or what?
Here in the state of Kansas, it's a little different than any other state. It's actually in our Kansas Constitution that specifically spells out Article 5 of the United States Constitution. Any vote regarding anything related to the Article 5 has to have a 2/3 majority.
2/3, okay.
And the reason why it's a resolution is because in the United States Constitution, it says on the application of the several state legislatures.
Okay, so governor would not be involved
Correct.
except in his, prestige as lobbying or whatever.
Well, let me ask, where would this convention be held if you got the requisite number of states, and how long could it last?
We're going to have a new convention center here in Wichita, Carl. We could have it here.
I think that's a capital idea.
That is great, actually. Well, that's actually a good question. And Congress plays two roles in this whole process. And the first role they get is to call the convention. So they get to name the time and the place that this thing starts. But again, just when it starts. So when the convention convenes, they meet. they can gavel in and change that location. I would say that the states probably don't want to meet in Washington, D.C., where Congress tells them to meet, so they'll probably gavel in and immediately adjourn after they set a new time in place. So as far as the time frame, the states are paying for this, so that's a key issue. So the states do have to foot the bill as far as their delegation. And that's a good thing, because that's going to keep the time factor down. This is not going to be a Washington, D.C. boondoggle, and the states are going to want to keep this thing wrapped up fairly tightly.
Well, we should have it like in a Motel 6 in Garden City or something. Yeah.
Well, but then it gets into questions. The devil is in the details. What sort of rules would they operate under? Could they do like the U.S. Constitution did in 1787? And we talked about Twitter. What if they held a closed and a closed meeting?
Well, you talked about Twitter. You just mentioned Twitter. I don't see that being even a possibility in today's age in social media. I mean, the Trump administration can't keep anything secreted within his own administration, let alone there's no way you could put 50 states together and their delegates into a sequestered type environment and be able to keep it secret. There's just no way. I would see this as a hugely televised event. I would imagine C-SPAN covering it.
Made for C-SPAN.
And just watching it and be quite, for me, I think it would be exhilarating to watch. I was at the simulated Article 5 convention.
Well, tell us about that simulation. How did that go?
It went fantastic. And I'm telling you, all we did as an organization was to get the delegates there. And we had delegates from all 50 states present, and most of them were sitting legislators.
I see.
And so they were very familiar with decorum as far as the rules of decorum and Mason's rules and they took it from there. We just let them go, essentially. We just said, okay, go. They elected their president from the body, and it was a Utah representative that was elected as the president of the body.
And how many days did it go on for?
It only deliberated for 2 days.
2 days.
And they were able to propose out 6 amendments. The one thing that you'd be shocked that they didn't propose was a balanced budget amendment. They said they would probably need one, but they needed a little bit more time to hammer out the details on that one.
And what were some of the amendments? Can you just run through those in the moment or so we have left?
Yeah, absolutely. They repealed the 16th Amendment, which is income tax. They also modified the 17th Amendment and put the states back in control of their senators, the U.S. senators.
So that U.S. senators would no longer be directly elected by the people of the state and would be elected again by the legislators?
They did. They worked on that. And what actually came out of it was something that didn't take the vote away. They allowed the vote to still have the vote of the people from each state to elect their senators, but they made the senators accountable to the legislature in Kansas. So if you have a case like Obamacare, where we have a state that's very much against it, and yet your U.S. senator is voting for it, like in Virginia's case, that would no longer happen. They were still beholden to the
does it ground for recalling the senator?
Yes, they could recall their U.S. senator and replace them in the interim, or call for a new election. Yes. So.
Okay. That would be a dramatic shift.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it is important to remember the Senate used to represent the states, not
That's
the people, but that has changed. David, we're just about out of time, so if viewers want to get a hold of you or to learn more about this, what should they do?
They should first go to conventionofstates.com.
Okay, we'll have that in the show notes.
Yeah, absolutely. Convention of States. They can do a lot of different things on that particular site. One thing that they should do is sign up and make sure that they get updates from our website.
Get some email updates, yeah.
And they can choose to volunteer at whatever level they want, because what this movement is a grassroots movement. And we need a lot of grassroots activists out there pushing for this within their state.
And just to make sure quickly, I think, what's the status of this in Kansas?
We actually didn't get out of committee this particular year. Last year, we had a vote on the House floor, and we were 7 votes short. So we had 77 votes in favor on the House floor.
And the Senate has never voted on this?
We have never brought it in before the Senate. We've had a committee hearing in the Senate, but we didn't push the issue after we failed in the House.
Okay. Well, David Schneider, thanks very much for being on Wichita Liberty TV. Carl, thank you as well. And that's a wrap for this week of Wichita Liberty TV.
Sign the petition at cosaction.com and get as many of your friends and family to do the same. With your full address, your state legislators will know that you really are their constituents in their district. Our success depends on you, so we're inviting you to be part of history. Let's invoke the constitutional solution that's as big as the problem.